Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today our topic is resultant of two forces. When two forces act in a direction have a same effect as a single force, this is known as resultant of two forces. It means when two forces have same effect as a single force, this is known as resultant of two forces. For example, if 30 Newton of force acts in a direction and the 40 Newton is also acting in the same direction, so how can we find the resultant of these both forces? So the resultant of these both forces, we will add these both forces with one another. Now the resultant of these both forces will be 17 Newton. Why? Because these forces acts in the same direction. When the forces acts in the same direction, the resultant of the forces will be 70 Newton. It means the resultant of the forces will be increased to 70 because these forces acts in the same direction. If the force number 2, if the forces acts in opposite direction, for example, if 40 Newton force acts in one direction and 30 Newton is acting in another direction, this time we will subtract the 30 from 40. Why? Because these forces acts in opposite direction and the forces don't act in the same direction. They are acting in opposite direction. Therefore, we will subtract 30 from 40. So the 10 Newton will be the resultant of these both forces and the 10 Newton will be the resultant and they have the same effect as a single force. So the 10 Newton will be resultant as a single force will be in the direction of 40 Newton. We can also find the resultant of two forces using this rule, parallelogram rules, in the case when the forces acts at an angle. For example, the 30 Newton force acts in this direction and the 40 Newton force acts in this direction. This time both forces acts at an angle to each other. So this time we can find the resultant of these both forces using parallelogram rules. So how can we find the resultant of these both forces, 40 Newton and 30 Newton, that are at an angle 26 degree? First, we will draw this force and this to make an angle. Then we will draw a diagonal between these both forces. Now we will join the head of this arrow to the head of the diagonal and also the head of this forces to the head of this diagonal. Now the diagram is known as parallelogram. Before this we will also we will learn about the suitable scale. We should choose a suitable scale for finding these forces. For example, if 1 centimeter represent 10 Newton, then 3 centimeter will represent 30 Newton and 4 centimeter will represent 40 Newton. So we will draw this line 4 centimeter, which will represent 40 Newton force, and this line will be 3 centimeter, which will represent 30 Newton force, because 1 centimeter represent 30 Newton. So this line will be 3 centimeter and this line will be 4 centimeter. Now when we will join these lines with one another and these arrows with one another and to form the parallelogram, now we will measure the diagonal. So what is the measure of diagonal? It means that how many centimeter will be the diagonal long. So that diagonal will be 6 centimeter long. Why? Because each centimeter represent 10 Newton force. So this diagonal will be the resultant of these both forces that are acting at an angle. So the diagonal is 60 Newton. It means that the resultant of these two forces will be 60 Newton using this method, parallelogram method. Why? Because this diagonal will be 6 centimeter and the diagonal represents 60 Newton force. So this is the third way for finding the resultant of two forces. Now I will repeat when two forces have same effect as a single force. This is known as resultant of forces. So resultant of forces can be found using these three methods. If the forces are acting in the same direction, then we will add these forces and the resultant will be 70 Newton. If we will add 40 to 30 Newton, resultant will be 70. If these are acting in opposite direction, 40 is acting in one direction and 30 is acting in the opposite direction, then the resultant will be 10 Newton force that will be in the direction of 40 Newton. And the third method, parallelogram rules, can also be used for finding the resultant of two forces, and by this method we can find the resultant of two forces using a suitable scale. First we will choose a suitable scale for this method. For example, if 1 centimeter represent 10 Newton, then 3 centimeter line will represent 30 Newton and 4 centimeter represent 40 Newton. The diagonal will be 6 centimeter, which will represent 60 Newton force, and this 60 Newton force will be the resultant of the both forces.